Hi, everybody. All right, so it is my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's panel, Decade of Fire, Activation and Accountability. Again, my name is Anna Lee, and I co-direct Working Films. We are a nonprofit based in Wilmington, North Carolina, but working nationally for almost 20 years now, using documentary film to advance social justice and environmental protection. So, every day I get to do this work of kind of straddling the world of organizers and filmmakers and artists. And so I'm really excited for today's panel to kind of explore the intersection of those worlds in depth with you through the lens of this incredible film, Decade of Fire, that premiered yesterday at Doc NYC. Congrats again. So I just also want to say thank you to Doc NYC for having us here, and also to the Ford Foundation, both the JustFilms program and the Cities and States program at the Ford Foundation for making this possible. So to get us started, I'm just going to let each of the panelists introduce yourselves and just kind of give us a quick overview of who you are and your relationship to the film.
My name is Vivian Vazquez, co-director, co-producer, Decade of Fire.
Hi, I'm Sheila Garcia. I'm the director at CASA. It's a nonprofit located in the Southwest Bronx. We do tenant organizing, leadership development, and we're a member-led organization. So the community members are the ones who decide what our campaigns and what the work looks like. And so we're really community-led, and we work on campaigns around rezonings to changing policies or creating policies that really benefit tenants, and not only in the Southwest Bronx, but throughout the whole city.
Hey folks, my name is Jerry Maldonado. I'm the acting director at the Ford Foundation, our Cities and States program. Our program works on issues around housing, community engagement, coalition building, advocacy. I've had the distinct pleasure of working with CASA on some of the work in New York City around the rezoning, and obviously with Decade of Fire around the production and in supporting its impact campaign, which we'll talk about today.
Thanks, everybody. So yeah, we're gonna dig into it in just a few minutes around really kind of what is the ecology of the partnerships that you see reflected here from the film team, the organizers and funders, and kind of how that mix of ingredients creates the possibility for impact with this film and documentary films in general. So to get us started, though, I'm going to give you some, in case you weren't at the premiere yesterday and need some context to the film. We're going to let Vivian tell us a little bit about the story, and then we're going to watch a trailer.
So Decade of Fire is an exploration of why the South Bronx was left to burn during the 1970s. It also celebrates the residents of the South Bronx who, despite being blamed for the destruction of the Bronx, actually helped save the Bronx.
Thank you. All right, so we're going to start with you, Vivian, and hoping you could tell everyone a little bit about kind of the genesis of the film and the vision that you all had for why you wanted to make it and how you want it to be out in the world. And particularly within that, if you could talk about kind of how your role as both co-director and central character in the film kind of is helping get toward that vision.
We first started to think about a film. Actually, we didn't think about that. We thought about writing a curriculum for high school students about the history of the South Bronx. That was during the early 2000s when money came pouring into New York City public schools to create small schools. And so my co-director, Julia Allen, and I began to work on a curriculum. And quite frankly, she did most of the work, but we were working on a curriculum to teach history, and that curriculum never got implemented. But the spark grew from there, wanting to teach young people history of the Bronx, and also unearthing and sort of uncovering what happened. I mean, one of the things that Julia was very interested in was how I grew up, sleeping with our shoes on just in case there was a fire, not having heat or hot water for 4 to 6 months at a time during the winter, sort of having to deal with that. or any other issue that she was just fascinated by it, and she suggested that we work on writing something together. And then she all of a sudden called me one day and said, I have a dream, we need to do a film. And so then she introduced me to Gretchen Hildebrand and Anna Jacobs, and I'll never forget Broadway, 41st Street. It was about 6 p.m. and we sized each other up and said, you want to do it? Want to work? You want to work together? Maybe. Yeah, okay. Gretchen is the filmmaker. Gretchen has the expertise. And I started out as a subject of the film, and then very soon realized that I was also going to be very responsible for how this story was told, and I felt very responsible for how I was going to represent my history and my community in telling the story.
Absolutely, thanks. Okay, Sheila, if you could tell everyone a little bit more about the work that you do at CASA and kind of your engagement with the film to date, and how what you're excited about as it comes out into the world and can be used in your work.
Yeah, so the work we do at CASA is really member-led, and so engaging community members in a way that feels genuine, where they're really leading the work and making decisions about issues that impact them. And for us, centering our members and seeing the direction of the film felt like a real natural progression. And when we were talking about it, and I often say this, I came to the United States when I was 6. I didn't know the history of what was happening in the Bronx, and started to organize and started to learn about the history of the Bronx in a different context in my mid-20s. And I felt really overwhelmed by that history, and not really understanding when I was at college why people would be like, "Oh, you grew up in the Bronx? Have you ever seen someone get shot?" And all those things that Vivian talks about in the film really hit home. And so we used the film trailer, actually, earlier versions of it, in our Leadership Institute to talk about the history of the Bronx. And a lot of our members lived through literally that decade, and were there and dealt with a lot of the issues. And so just the trailer would spark really intense conversations. Sometimes we didn't even know some of our members were even in the in New York City when that was happening, or the stories that they shared. And so it was really for us an opportunity to be able to share a history that hasn't been told, and something that you're constantly blamed for. And so in our work, I think that when Vivian and Julia were like, "Oh, we would like to get your feedback and think about how you can integrate or use a film to galvanize and inspire people to the work that you already do and keep them connected," I was so excited. And then when they were like, "Oh, we're trying to think about how that would be used in schools," I reached out to my network of friends, because I used to teach arts and crafts before I did organizing in schools throughout the Bronx, and reached out to folks to see how they could also be engaged in using this as part of their schools lessons. And so I think that the film itself lends itself to being an opportunity to really have people self-reflect, and that often, and we do this in organizing all the time, people are told it's your fault. You didn't work hard enough, you don't have a good job because it's your fault, you're not educated enough, you should speak English, this is why you're never gonna get ahead, you don't have heat and hot water because you don't, and not everybody in the building pays rent, and so it's always you're not doing something. And I think the film actually talks about the struggle in a way that there are policies and structures in place, and not only here, but throughout the whole country, that actually still have impact right now, and impact how we see ourselves. And I think that growing up in the Bronx, it really not knowing that history and learning it, and then meeting people who lived through it, and then seeing that we're still fighting for heat and hot water in some buildings, that we're still fighting for people to have a right to stay in apartments that they've lived for 30 years and raised generations. And I think that film itself is a real good tool to have a candid conversation about how we need to stop blaming ourselves and really push that aside in order to move forward and create the next future and use it I think has been mentioned a few times, and in the film, highlighting the conversations between Vivian and her son to teach it forward and think about how do we use that as we move forward to really engage the youth to learn their history and also learn how to fight back.
And I think just for the filmmakers out there, like your acknowledgement that the film team, has been working with you and letting you use the trailer and doing this work even, for years, right, before the film has been finished. I think it's just such a powerful example of ways that you can start to be, again, thinking about your impact and engagement strategy, from the origins of the film itself and the creative process. So just appreciate you lifting that up. And so now on to you, Jerry. Would be great if you could tell folks just what drew you and your team, the Just Cities and Regions program at Ford, to this project, and kind of how do you see the storytelling and then the impact work that the film can do as fitting in with your mission and your programs?
So the Ford Foundation is a social justice foundation, and as a social justice foundation, we really try to address some of the underlying drivers of inequality in the country. And my program specifically really focuses on issues of housing, land, and development. And as we all kind of know, living here in New York City and across the country, we're in the middle of a massive affordability crisis in the country. Millions of families are literally one paycheck away from eviction. 70% of extremely low-income families pay more than half of their incomes in rent. Nowhere in the country can a family making minimum wage afford a 2-bedroom apartment. Nowhere in the country, right? Even though we're in the midst of this massive crisis, right, nationally, that story isn't told or doesn't necessarily come to the forefront of national policy conversations. And when it is, it's framed around a simple challenge of demand and supply, right? That the problem is that there isn't enough supply of affordable housing, and the challenge is that the market, right? We can't control the market is what it is, and so, the best we can do is try to kind of keep up and put in measures to try to protect and build more affordable housing, right? So that's kind of the story that's told. Unfortunately, that story neglects a deeper history, right? A deeper history and a recognition of the fact that the current gentrification and displacement crisis is the current incarnation of a long history, an arc of displacement, divestment, reinvestment in places that historically has had a strong intersection between race, place, and kind of power and democracy. And that ultimately, the current housing crisis isn't a technical problem, right? Fundamentally, it's a political problem. And that in order to address it, what we actually need to do is have a larger frame around racial and economic justice and contextualize, right, how we think about investment in housing within this broader arc. So from our perspective, our team at Ford was really interested in this film because it was fundamentally challenging kind of the narrative and the story around development and displacements and presenting it within a much broader historical arc that really kind of laid out and made visible some of those invisible power dynamics that are driving development and that have driven development historically in a way that's prioritized profits over people. And I'll say, so a key part of our work at the Ford Foundation within our team is really kind of rethinking both the policies and the politics that drive development. And so from our perspective, we saw this film as one kind of a really important mechanism to kind of challenge the underlying story, right? To reframe that story, and then to create a series of tools and a strategy that use this film as a starting point, right? And so from the very beginning, as we engaged the filmmakers and producers, we were really interested in thinking about how this film could really serve, one, be embedded within a broader movement. And I think that, part of what we're hearing now is the way this film was created, it came from movement, right? It was inspired by movement, right? Movement was in it and defining it from the very beginning. And so our role in partnership with our JustFilms team at the foundation has really been a really kind of productive partnership when thinking about the creative aspects of the storytelling, the film itself, and then how that film is embedded within a broader organizing and coalition building strategy.
And Vivian, I'm wondering actually if you could tell us a little bit more about the specifics of what that sort of interaction with the broader movement work and the plans are that have been developed with movement leaders across the country. In full disclosure, Working Films has been working with the team on the design of some of the Impact campaign where they were recipients of a Impact Kickstart program that we have, which is awards in-kind support to 4 film teams a year for developing their audience engagement and impact strategy. And so we're doing work together. So, just for me, it's been really impressive to see how deeply the plans have emerged from, these really authentic relationships with organizers around the country. So can you just tell folks a little bit more about kind of some of the highlights of what's on deck for the film as it rolls out and how organizers have shaped that?
Right, so as we heard from Sheila and Jerry, the approach to creating this film came from, an organic process, right? We spent a lot of time talking and being in community and listening to the voices and sharing those voices. And we had conducted quite a bit of research, but it was also embedded in the voice of the community. And so in moving forward, we want to share the story of displacement, of zoning, institutional racism, of housing discrimination in a way that helps people act on it so that we become agents of change, right? And so we're taking the film on the road, and what we're going to do is work with local organizations, mostly housing justice organizations, to connect the dots, because my story is the story of a lot of other people who grew up in cities that were neglected and abandoned by government. And we're going to connect the dots. We're also going to inspire people, just like our film seeks to inspire people, that community can take action and they can fight for justice and they can fight for just housing, quality housing. We're going to start doing a New York City rollout in January, and then we're going to move on to Puerto Rico, and then we're going to go across the eastern seaboard, and then we're going to travel all the way up and down across the country to different cities, Detroit, Atlanta, to also, one of the interesting things about our process is that we're not approaching organizations and saying, hey, we have an idea, here's our film, we're going to show it to you, and we're hoping that we're going to inspire your people at your site. No, we're asking them the questions, how is this going to work for you? How will it serve your community? How will it serve? We're going to provide you with a venue to look at our film, but it's on your terms. You tell us how you want this film to support the work that you're currently doing. And I think that's been very important, and it's been part of our process from the beginning.
Yeah, it's so huge. Making sure that you're there, to support their organizing needs, and you've created this amazing vehicle to be able to do that. And maybe to just highlight a couple of the other elements that I think are great tools for doing that. That I know that y'all have been working on in addition to the tours. Are the module idea? Can you tell folks a little bit more about that?
So a couple of people actually, more than a couple of people last night told me, oh my God, this should be a series. You need to do 5-7 different movies. And it's because once we talk about different aspects of the film, I think that there's a lot more that we can go into in depth, the implications of the Rand Corporation's work in the South Bronx, the implication of the Big Mac, right, the Fiscal Control Board during the 1970s and what that did to the South Bronx. And so what we're doing is we're creating these small modules that will deepen understanding of those events, those strategies, and also strategies of block defense, how to protect your neighborhood, how to organize. And we're going to work on sharing those modules with the different organizations that we're working with, so that we can help to also make the connections a little bit more deeper that we could not undergo in the film.
If I just can add, I mean, I think one of the things that was really exciting working with the team on is the fact that, you know, these modules were conceptualized early on in the process, actually, right, as they were making the film. So this wasn't kind of an afterthought. Really, as they were producing the film, there were all these key themes, right, that we knew we could go, the filmmakers could go a lot deeper in, right? And so we wanted to create kind of spaces to continue to tell the story, right, and use pieces of the film in order to kind of ignite conversations that we knew from conversations with community were of high priority, right? And so I think one of the unique things in the process was really thinking about kind of the various products and modules, the curricula, early on, right, in the creation process, not as an afterthought after the film was done. And so it's actually given it kind of a new power and kind of dynamism and buy-in and ownership from community. And Sheila can say a lot more about kind of that process, because you guys really helped inform the thinking about what would be the modules that would be helpful. How could the storytelling actually help inform the organizing?
Yeah, and how can we use it to galvanize people, I think, at the end. And so so we were in conversations with Vivian and Julia for almost what it feels like a decade. But really, we've been using the trailer for a long time and seeing the impact of just seeing the trailer on our members. We do talk about redlining in our work, but there isn't something that really tells your story and uses the policies that impacted that story in a way that like is digestible and it's through storytelling in a way that the film really does it well. And so we've been meeting just in New York City to try to think of what a rollout in New York City looks like and how can we use it to benefit what's happening in local communities. And so we're probably gonna screen it in anywhere between 8 to 10 different locations throughout the city in communities who would historically not have access to the film. I mean, you think about who gets access to documentary films and goes to screenings of some films. It's not, our members. And so really providing a venue for them to see the film in their location and also being able to we're actually drafting questions and conversations and thinking about how can we film them. Can we air them, live stream them to other communities who wouldn't otherwise be able to attend? And so there's all these strategies of how do we share and have conversations. And at the end, how do we actually take pride in the history of the struggle? Which is so important. I mean, I grew up being told you live in a, bad place, you have bad conditions, and it's all your fault. And no one told me that people remained while the Bronx was burning, that people have been fighting, that people have been organizing. And often, I think, even with some of the questions that arose last night, we hear that sentiment of, what can we do now, and what's the point of fighting if we're fighting like a losing battle? Often people ask, and I think the struggle that happened in the 70s and kept going in the 80s and the 90s, and now we've rebuilt a community and have a sense of ownership of this community where we we say we're from the Bronx and we're proud. That actually lends itself to be able to have these conversations and use these modules to have in-depth conversations about things that people historically wouldn't want to talk about. Like redlining isn't like the most sexy topic that you're going to bring up at a retreat or in a space with members, but like seeing it from Vivian's view or being able to talk about it and actually show it in video versus like having a professor come in and tell you what redlining is really impactful and helps us do the political education that we have to do in order to build leaders who are going to be leading this struggle as we move forward.
Thank you. So, clearly we're talking about the extent to which both the storytelling and the plans for impact with this film are grounded in the voices and the needs of community. And I think that is frankly like unique, or is something that filmmakers are often like striving for, but may not be the reality. So I'm interested to hear from y'all about how you think we can invite more people, to dig into this work of collaboration and of centering the voice and community, both as we're making stories and planning for how they can be released. Are there any sort of just highlights of that process or moments for you that stood out that you think are kind of an invitation for other folks to engage in the ways that you all have?
Maybe I can just say a few things. I think often when we're approached by media in general about our work, they say, can you create this event? Or what is the event that lets me tell X story? And I think what the film does is actually follow a story and of actually something that happened without having to be like forced. And it's like really natural and it progresses really naturally. And I think as like we've been doing our work at CASA, I think something we've started to do better is actually tell our own story. And so as much as filmmakers and folks who are in that field, I don't know how to film anything other than like a video of a kid walking or my cat. It's really like a thing to think about, like how do we tell the story of people who would historically not be able to have a voice? And then how do we do it with grace where they feel proud, where they don't feel like a backdrop or a prop or something that they're going to be used to tell a story that benefits somebody? Or like we want to, I don't know, we want a story of a single mom who's doing X and this is why, and you know, and like the saddest story you could possibly find me, and like that's often what we're asked to do. And I think there is something about this of just hearing someone's voice and you know the good things and the bad things that happen and telling it in their own voice versus like forcing it. And I think that that's something that I appreciate about the film, but I also have now, as like we've in the last few years, have seen more folks approach us, like just say, hey, how can we share stories about your work? And for us to figure out what that is and what story we want to be telling, and how we want to be talking about our struggle in a way that feels powerful and empowering.
As some of kind of my grantees and organizer friends always say, you know, you're either kind of at the table or you're on the menu, right? And so I think what's really powerful about this film, right, is that you have community actually kind of not only at that table, but defining kind of, right, what's on the menu and how the story is told, right? And I think that's really, really important because I think centering community is critical in that, you know, who tells a story sets the kind of agenda. And part of the challenge in setting the agenda is that you have to challenge power dynamics. And so part of this renegotiation, right, is challenging kind of power dynamics along multiple areas. One is challenging power dynamics between the creatives and community, right? There are real power dynamics there. And as you mentioned, sometimes what happens is that you develop a relationship that becomes more extractive and objectifying, right? Rather than kind of additive and empowering, right? So I think that's the first challenge. How do you kind of challenge those power dynamics? And I think the process of this filmmaking, the way it was so iterative and engaged with community along the way, really kind of challenged some of those dynamics. That's the first thing, I think. Second, there's power dynamics between philanthropy and filmmakers, right? And within foundations, there are power dynamics. And so this project itself is pretty unique within Ford in that it was a partnership between the city's program and the JustFilms program. And so, you know, there's so many silos in philanthropy, right? Or folks call them, you know, our cylinders of excellence, right? Everyone's in their cylinder of excellence, right? And so this was an opportunity for us really to bridge the gap, right? Bringing kind of my program's work that was deeply around policy and organizing with the JustFilms team that kind of deeply understands storytelling and filmmaking and production, bringing those two to bear in conversation with the production team, with the filmmakers, right? And so I remember many times we had these conversations where they'd show us kind of pieces of the film as it was developing, and we'd engage in these really rich conversations back and forth about the story they were trying to tell, how it was connected to the organizing, from our perspective, how it was connected within a broader community, right, of either policy or kind of filmmaking. And so I think that to do this well, we have to get better at negotiating power. Right? Negotiating power among and between ourselves in a way that ultimately lifts up the story of the folks that we say we're supporting.
Vivian, do you want to add anything about just kind of any moments from the creative process that kind of highlight that centering of?
Yeah, well, speaking of power, so I'm, you know, the kid who grew up in the South Bronx without any power. And what this film did was give me power back. Yeah, I mean, I'm clearly narrating and I'm a subject of the film, but I actually co-directed, co-produced, and co-wrote with Gretchen because she was not going to let me not tell my story. She wasn't going to let me tell her story. She was going to be the you know, the venue or the way. And it was, I think that because of that, it took longer to make the film. There were weekly meetings for almost 10 years, for 2 hours just about every week. There were lots of visits to the Bronx and to Brooklyn, and there was an expectation, and especially when Nathan came along, that we were all going to be a part of creating this story and linking the story of my family, my community, to the bigger narrative of the film. And so it put me in a position where I was just really involved in every single aspect of the film. And I think that's unique. You look at films and you can see that there's a film that's being done about a community or a person, and the person's usually the subject, but I became part of the sort of the group that was responsible for getting that film out into the world. From graphics, when I think Gretchen drove me crazy. She wanted to know my opinion about the graphics so much, and I was like, I don't know. If I may, her insistence that I go and be part of the sound mixing, and I wasn't clearly sure why I needed to be part of the sound mixing process. But when I got there, the questions that I was asked, like, how does it sound? What did fire sound to you across the way? What did the city sound to you? What did that pain sound like, Vivian? Then I got it. Oh, I am important to the making of this film. And so, yeah, I mean, I was, in terms of like the power that we all share, from the filmmakers to the power given to the community, to the power given to all the partners to create the story, has taken us a while to get there, but I think that in the end, we're happy that it became an authentic story.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as I said, as someone who's been doing this work for a really long time, you all just had this confluence of elements that were, active choices, right? It was not an accident that these things happened. 10 years of 2-hour production meetings, and the intentionality with the engagement of organizations starting, years before the film has rolled out is, our active choices that you all made, that I think are a model for that I think other filmmakers can look to. I want to talk a little bit more before we turn to audience questions about just kind of the rollout of the campaign and kind of the different elements it has and how that might relate to fundings of impact work. Because I know, there's a lot of filmmakers in the audience, and one of the questions is, this all sounds great, but how do we get the funding to make this happen? So I think one of the things that's interesting about this project and the plans for the impact is the sort of scale of the campaign. So you have this national level rollout with a 30-city tour, but also some really targeted elements of, a New York specific rollout, plan to tour Puerto Rico and make the connections between the story and things that are unfolding in Puerto Rico today. And so would love, Jerry, if you could talk a little bit about, from a funder's perspective, of kind of how that all of the elements of the campaign are important to you and to your work, but also how that might open up opportunities for funding from other kinds of funders as well.
So, one of the things that's really powerful about the film is that it touches on 3 kind of interrelated things, right? It's about people, place, and kind of power, right? And so within kind of the funder landscape, there are funders that fund different things, whether they're issues, communities, places, or approaches to storytelling. And so kind of this film gives us an entry point to engage a whole range of funders, national funders, local, regional, place-based funders, either around a constituency kind of approach, about folks, right? There are lots of folks who are funding kind of racial justice, economic justice work. That's a kind of a core theme, right, kind of in the film. There are funders who are interested more in specific places, in housing and development, a whole nother set of funders, right? There are kind of the arts and film funders, a whole nother kind of other set of funders. And so what this film enables us to do is, through the impact campaign, is to identify some key themes and approaches that we think are really important and part of a broader kind of national conversation, right? And so right now, for example, there are 3 modules, right? The first module is really around kind of organizing, the power of organizing, right? That is an approach that many funders in philanthropy are supporting, right? And kind of anchoring our work around kind of structural change and inequality, or an understanding the importance and power of organizing, coalition building to challenge and transform the power dynamics that you mentioned, right? So that's an important first, both an approach that funders support and an initial kind of module. A second module touches on this issue of really kind of democracy, right, and development, right? It's embodied within this issue of the control board, but it touches on these much bigger themes of corporate power, accountability, democracy, and kind of corporate capture of democracy, right? Again, another set of funders who are also interested in that body of work, right? And the third piece really touches on this issue of kind of algorithms, right? Kind of the way in which basically, technocratic approaches to development disguise kind of these power dynamics, right? And support kind of market-driven approaches to development that undermine kind of communities, right? So those modules touch on a whole range of themes, right? In addition to those modules, we've got kind of the curriculum and the learning guide. And so what we at Ford have been trying to do is work with kind of a national kind of set of partners through various funder affinity groups, including NFG, which is a national funder affinity group that includes funders who are interested in housing and economic justice and racial justice issues. We have local funder collaboratives like Neighborhoods First Fund. And so the idea really is to layer different philanthropic interests across those different issue areas to support different pieces of a campaign. We think it's a real model, right, that combines both issue-based kind of funding with constituency-based and kind of approaches.
Definitely, and it mirrors, it's a lot of our experience at Working Films as well, as we're trying to help filmmakers develop their campaigns. Do that, we say, what is the, who's, in addition to this landscape of film funders, who's funding on your issue, and where, and it can be, an exciting opportunity for folks that they might not have imagined previously. So I think I would like to ask y'all about any advice that you might give to filmmakers in the room as they are listening to this and really processing the ways that you all have been deeply accountable to one another, and most importantly to the community whose story is being told in this film. Are there any sort of pieces of advice or sort of big learnings that you have from this experience that you would say that you want filmmakers to take away?
I think that the collaboration, like I said before, is an important aspect, and that we often, because we have to expedite the work a lot, and people are always running up against deadlines and goals and benchmarks, but I think that one of the things that I'm taking away that I would wish to share is that in order to get there, to create a true collaboration with all the different players, community, organizations, funders, that we have to make the time to talk and to create the safe space to make that time and sort of hold that value and in spite of the deadlines and the pressures of trying to produce something within a particular time frame.
Thanks. Either of you guys want to add anything?
I would say that the thing that I've always been really proud of, like supporting or giving feedback around this film the whole time, was that we were always asked, how could you use the film? And so if your intention is to highlight a community and to hopefully inspire folks to support those communities, or like inspire the community to like see themselves in a new light. That if you're asking those community members, even if that's across the country, if that's across New York City, you're just asking like, how could you use it? And if your intention is for community members to see themselves, and I think that this film does that, and that was one of the intentions, to see themselves and not in the light that other people were, in the way that they were talking about them, but see themselves as who they saw themselves in that moment. That if that's the intention of how folks will use it, that you should ask of how, like, are we creating modules? Are we gonna have conversations after the film? And I think that there is something about just being able to get questions from the audience, or create guiding questions for folks about the impact or how they felt when they see it. I think that even just showing the trailer for us, we saw members, which, you know, I'm like half the age of most of our members about, and so a lot of the time we would have people just burst out into tears, who turn on the lights and half the crowd was crying, just because they've never seen themselves that way. They've never even seen film of some of the fires, because they didn't have heat and hot water or electricity during the time, and so there was just this history that they had never seen themselves in. And so if that's the intention of the film, that or whatever you're creating, that's something that you should think about. How do we center these communities and give them access, because they otherwise wouldn't have. And you know, even last night there was a lot of Bronx folks there. There was a lot of teachers who worked on some of the curriculum with their students there. A lot of my members were there, members from all over the city who actually are doing this work right now, are fighting and are resisting. And I think that shows who and what was being centered throughout the whole time, but also as we move forward how the film is actually going to be used. And I think that's really incredible, and I encourage folks who are creating any kind of media to think about how we can do more of that.
Thank you.
And my message to funders is to kind of believe and invest in the power of communities to tell their own story, right? That we need to shift those resources and shift those power dynamics across both kind of film and issue-based funders.
Thank you all so much. We want to open it up to the audience to take some questions. Right. And there's a mic over here, if you have one. Or if you think you can be really loud, maybe go for it.
I was just curious. I haven't seen the film yet. I'd love to see it. But in terms of, I made a film that also is it's an immigration film, and there's a balance that I've tried to strike in terms of an issue and advocacy, right? And understanding that. And some of us want to make films that, and we're comfortable making films that are advocacy, and some of us shy away from that a little bit. And I wonder if there was any discussion surrounding that, or it was, this is our goal, or this is a film and we're going to advocate for a certain thing, or you try to balance that and not make it advocacy driven, or just trying to unpack that and understanding how you approach that.
I think that when we first started out, we didn't realize that it was going to be an advocate. I mean, I'm saying the first year or so, we didn't realize it was going to become an advocacy film. It was a story about why the burning, and then we realized, wait a minute, this was wrong, and we need to share this story, and it can't just stay that way. It just can't be a story of, oh, the Bronx burned, these were the causes, thank you very much. But it was more like, oh my God, we need to figure out a way to educate the community about what they can do to never let that happen again, or any other, unjust policy. And so I'm not sure that we talked a lot about advocacy, but I'm not sure that that was out of the mix. We knew that early on we were going to use the film to support advocacy work. Is that fair, Gretchen? Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, we had a question over here.
Can I just add, from an organizing perspective, is that we often shy away from being in places where there is conflict, where people might disagree and not like or think we're taking a side. And I think in the current political climate we're in, that not doing that actually means we are part of the systematic issues that we're seeing. And I think that there is something about telling a story and just calling it for what it is and saying the story is hard to look at, it hurts, and that's okay, because we're hoping to learn not to feel that pain again.
And can I say, I think that what this film does well is that it's not a strategic communications piece. It's not about a particular piece of legislation or a particular position on something. It actually goes much deeper, right? So it is telling a different story, right, around a whole set of things that have multiple policy implications, which you can debate, right? So it doesn't assume necessarily a policy position. What it does is lay bare, right, kind of a whole history, a set of assumptions, an approach to community, right? And in doing that, creates the opportunity for advocacy and organizing and for different conversations to happen in different communities. And so to me, that's the real power, is that it embeds these policy fights within kind of a much broader kind of historical and moral arc that often isn't the way in which these issues are framed. When we talk about housing and development, they're so technical, they're so in the weeds, redlining, FHA, right? This lays bare, right, kind of the core values, the core power dynamics that drive inequality. And I think that that's a different way to think about kind of the relationship between filmmaking and like social change.
One of our main characters, Hedy Foxx, she exercised, or she practiced something that she called block defense, which is interesting because 80% of the housing stock in the South Bronx burned, right? But her block did not burn because she, what she calls, exercised block defense. And soon we were thinking, oh my God, everybody's gonna have to learn what she did. How did she implement block defense, and how is it that she was able to save her block? We need to share that with others so that they can learn how to save their own neighborhoods as well.
Thanks. Right over here.
Hi, thank you guys so much. I really think this conversation is so important. So I'm actually coming at this from an international experience. I hope that's still relevant, but I think a lot of what we're talking about, there's this conspicuous question of where does the filmmaker lie with respect to the story they're trying to tell. And so I've really been grappling with this, the process of gaining access and embedding in a struggle that is not my own was sort of built from the beginning on, promising that there was reciprocity and that the film sort of be like a decolonizing process in itself. But one thing that I struggle to think about in the long arc of how I would engineer some kind of campaign is how to honor the priorities of a community when they're very localized, and it might be really challenging to make that legible to funders internationally, or sort of how to situate it in a theme that is relevant to funders who may not have exposure to a struggle somewhere else. And then also kind of what it means to be a liaison and how to center voices when the goal as a filmmaker through the process obviously is to sort of humbly be a channel and not a spokesperson. So if you guys could speak to that.
Anybody want to jump in?
I mean, I think in our work at CASA, we're really local. Like, you can't get any more local than CASA's work, but the implication of our work and the leadership development that we've exercised is transferable internationally. And so in our work, we went to Quito for the when the UN was there, and our members met folks that were from Colombia and from all over South America, and even for me as a person, I was born in Venezuela, but I lived in the United States since I was 6. Hearing stories of we value land and owning land in the United States, and I feel like I grew up with that because I grew up here. And going there and hearing stories of folks who bought land and then got that land taken away, and the connections. And I think there is something about a learning process, and I feel like even with funders, often we have to explain our model and who we center and why we center those folks and why some movement work takes so long. And I think there is something about making those connections of saying, and our members often say, we just rent, and we went to Quito, and then some of our members came back, and it's it doesn't matter if you rent or own. When you're struggling with power and systematic oppression and racism, what you own, how you own it doesn't really matter, because at the end of the day, the struggle is still the same. And when we went to Canada and we were in Montreal, we also saw some of the same thing with the Native Americans there, Canadians. And, there was like a whole bunch of a reflection of actually these issues are the same, they just are in different places, and maybe there's like a little bit of a policy that's better in New York City that is in Quito, that it is in Canada, but actually the underlying issue, the underlying struggle of power, of ownership, of really money, and the real estate companies or real estate entities throughout the whole world is still like, that is like an underlying thing that I think when you unpack it in a way that is bare bones, and I think the story does this, and like how the story's told, that is actually told through someone's experience, it actually hits home in a different way. And I think that that's something, I mean, I'm not a filmmaker, so, but I think that there's something that organizing does, where it's like we are all on this together. And it doesn't matter if, you're Dominican, if you're West African, if you're from Puerto Rico, you've been here for 70 years. We are all fighting not having hot water right now. And that is like the thing we're gonna galvanize around, and then through that struggle, we're gonna learn all these things and love each other. And I think that there's something about telling stories that way.
And I'll just say, from kind of a funder perspective, again, what's powerful about films like this is that they pull these local stories, they tie these local stories into these macro themes of kind of power, democracy, justice, inclusion, exclusion, right? And so that's important. So as a funder, as you're kind of thinking about the funding landscape, is how do the themes from this story kind of resonate within these kind of broader themes that are transnational? Absolutely, these themes are absolutely transnational, even though the story takes place in a very particular community, right? And I think funders are interested in both kind of the themes, the approaches, and then the kinds of partnerships. I think that you're asking the right sets of questions in terms of how do you partner with community in a responsible way, and I think the way it was done was through deep sets of partnerships with folks who will own it, help shape it, and kind of move with it, as the film kind of evolves in its kind of different stages of development.
Right. If I could clarify just a little bit. So, of course, there's like interweaving that all of these challenges are, global on some level. But in terms of if a community, what is their priority in terms of what they want funded, is let's say a very small Indigenous language initiative in some community, sort of like how to honor what community actually wants and sort of package that in such a way that a funder can understand it as it's associated with a broader issue that might be closer to what they normally want to pay for or support.
Happy to talk.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Thank you guys so much.
Great. I think that we are pretty much out of time. So I just want to say thank you again to each of you for being here. Congratulations again on the film. And thank you to all of y'all for being here as well. We really appreciate it.